talk of old religions, I mean, for example, aren't there any differences between, for example, the Semitic religions and Indo-Iranian religions, or between God-oriented religions and non-theistic religions? Or what about religion as a belief system? When, for example, in sociological term, we say all belief systems have some kind of like notion of religion. Or as Eric Fromm actually once put it, can we talk of, for example, religion without transcendence? I mean, I have these questions in mind, and I think it would be interesting if you like reflect upon it, and then we start to talk about this. Mike or Dustin, whoever is ready, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sayed. I don't mind going first, but I just wanted to reflect on something Dustin said last time in the previous roundtable. I'm only joking, but I think it's quite fun. When Dustin spoke in the last meeting, he confessed something about himself. He said that he was taught how to play the drums by the former drummer for Miles Davis. He said he used to be good at improvisation, but now he's a father of 5 children, that he needs to kind of have a text and he needs to have a script. Well, I want to confess something about myself, Dustin, that when I was a young man, I was offered a sponsorship to be a professional disco dancer. And the improvisational approach is something that's always stuck with me. So I'm going to freestyle it again today. I don't have a paper to read from. I'm just going to I've got some ideas that I've been thinking about. And then Sayed very helpfully today throws in 20 more questions before we start speaking without any preparation whatsoever. But hopefully some of those will be covered anyway. I think it's a fascinating provocation. You know, it's intended to kind of, as Warren says, to create some kind of maybe even controversial thinking. I've spoken to a few people who I know in the last few days and said I'm going to be talking about whether religion is repressive or whether it's emancipatory or liberating. And to a person, this probably says a lot about the people I hang around with. They just immediately say, it's repressive. Religion's repressive. Well, of course, they're not sociologists. They're electricians, they're administrators, they're plumbers, okay? But they automatically say it's repressive. And I say, what do you mean by repressive? And a very simple answer comes back, that it stops you from doing things that you want to do. And then I give a sociological question. This is not a proper research project, you understand. And I say, but what makes you decide what it is that you want to do? Where does that come from? What gives you this idea that these are the things that you'd like to do, as opposed to these things that you think that you wouldn't be allowed to do if you were religious, whatever that means, whether that means in an institutional sense, the way Sayed means it, or as a kind of individual faith sense. But I think it's been interesting to give a little context to this, because I think what I would argue is that, as Warren said in the beginning, that religion has this capacity, this character to be either emancipatory or repressive, however you view it as an individual person. But I would argue that, and I'm only talking about what's happening in the UK, and I'm only talking mainly about Christianity, and specifically about Catholicism within Christianity. And it seems to me that religion, that form of religion, a faith, an attendance in a church, practicing a religious faith and abiding by these laws or rules or ways of being, these values, I think it's something that has been presented as repressive for a significant amount of time now, possibly over the last century, but increasingly so over the last 40 or 50 years. And I think the reason why it's been presented as repressive is because it is at odds with a capitalist economy, a capitalist society, and it's at odds specifically with the neoliberal variant of a capitalist society. So I was looking at some statistics, and 100 years ago, roughly, in the UK, roughly about 25% of the adult population regularly attended a Christian church. And that has fallen now to less than 10%. And the latest data suggests that about 850,000 people attend a Protestant church. That's the data I could find. Whereas 50 years ago, 50% of children attended a Sunday school. Now there's less than 4% of the age-related children who are attending a Sunday school. So there's been this kind of, this erosion, this, we know about this. We know that church attendance has fallen away, and former beautiful grand churches now are variously DIY centres, they are bistro restaurants, they are mosques, they're flats, they're apartments. They've been converted to these different uses because they're no longer needed or no longer thought to be needed within our society. But along with saying that, I think that there's been this intentional presentation of religion, however that's defined, as repressive within an increasingly secular society, which is based on materialism. I also think that the neoliberalism ideology is itself repressive. And I think it's failing the population. And I think that now, this might sound a bit provocative in itself, I think that there needs to be some kind of emancipation from the repressive nature and the damaging nature of a society which is essentially valueless, where we have Margaret Thatcher proclaiming at the dawn of our neoliberalist society, there is no such thing as society, there are only individuals, just look after yourself, don't worry about anybody else. And what we can see in terms of this last 40 or 50 years of extreme neoliberalist approach is not only a waning of religious faith and religious practice, but we've seen a dramatic increase in social ills, what I would call social ills, and I would say social indicators of a society that's actually in trouble. So this is just some data I found the last couple of days. If we're talking about drugs, we have over 5,000 drug-related deaths each year. So that's, that's over 10 people a week, or every single day, somebody's dying of a drug-related death. In terms of alcohol, between the ages of 15 and 49, the biggest cause of premature death in this country is related to alcohol misuse. And we have almost 30% of the population who are binge drinking, and they are way in excess of medical advice and recommendations for safe drinking habits. We've got a massive increase in suicide. I don't have the latest data. There's anecdotal data that COVID and the pandemic has significantly increased the number of suicides. But the data just prior to the pandemic was there's 18 to 20 people every day in this country committing suicide because of hopelessness, despair, anxiety, sense of failure. I personally know some very, very sad cases of people who leave letters saying, I don't think I'm good enough. I'm never going to be able to succeed. I'm never going to be able to provide a house for my family or retain the kind of job that I would like to retain. I'm no use. There's no point in me being here. So this sense of worth, it's something which is just, there's no foundation for self-esteem, a sense of self-worth within, I would say, neoliberalism, because everything's just seems to be quantified and evaluated in terms of materiality. Other addictions, workaholism. I think academics might be very familiar with that one, but it's a massive problem which is on the rise, where people are striving for more and more success and looking for a sense of meaning and fulfillment in their jobs rather than in something external to their jobs. So people are neglecting their families, becoming depressed, and this links with other addictions, gambling addictions, pornography addictions. I was looking up the data for that. Almost 10% of the adult population in this country is addicted to pornography, right? In terms of gambling, which also links with suicide and some of these other addictions, this is, in a sense, an audit of a society which has effectively just transformed in a relatively short space of time from a society which was firmly based on a Christian faith to one which is not really based on anything at all. In my own work, well, first of all, in my own kind of personal life, and this is anecdotal, a couple of years ago, there was 2 deaths within my wider circle. And it was very, very interesting how these 2 deaths were dealt with by the people concerned. So someone died, 83 years old. The family don't have a faith. They used to have a faith. The person who died had a faith. The children don't go to church. They've got no way of making sense of why an 83-year-old woman can die. They want people to live forever. And it was sheer devastation, despair, no way of making sense of it. Around the time that all that was happening, I got a message from another very close friend of mine who has a very, very strong Christian faith. And she said to me, Michael, I'm just writing to tell you that my father has just died. And isn't God wonderful that he gives us these words to comfort us? And then she copied the text of the Lord is my shepherd. And you had these 2 very different approaches where there's this acceptance that this is God's will. And we accept that, we don't worry about that. We don't need to make any more sense of it than that. And another family who are still trying to recover from the debris of the fallout of an elderly relative passing away in their 80s. So I would argue that religion can be, and in my experience is, profoundly emancipatory, because it kind of gives a meaning in a sense that's lacking in a society which has given up largely. And I know there's a growing Islamic faith in the UK that I'm not talking about here. I'm only talking about the demise of Christianity to a kind of secular society within the white population within the UK. And then in my work, I work specifically on the harmful consequences of wrongful conviction and wrongful imprisonment. And I've wanted to do a research project for many, many years. I mentioned to Warren, I was over in a conference in Harvard many years ago. It was an Innocence Project conference. And in Harvard, I met for the first time almost 100 exonerees, predominantly Black men who were convicted for rape and murder, predominantly of white women who spent, some of them, many decades in prison until DNA exonerated them, and in half of those cases, identified the real perpetrator. And I was struck by the way in which these people, these men, were at peace with this experience. Because in the UK, I'm personal friends of Paddy Joe Hill from the case called the Birmingham Six. If you've heard about miscarriages of justice, You may have heard of the Birmingham 6 case. Jerry Conlon from the Guildford 4, they made a movie about his life, In the Name of the Father, played by Daniel Day-Lewis. He was a personal friend of mine until he died a few years ago. Daily, I talk to victims of wrongful imprisonment. They're my people, they're my friends. They can't get over what happened to them. I ask them, do they have a faith? They say, to a person, how can there be a God, right? What kind of God would it be if I'm an innocent man being wrongly convicted? And they're angry, they have drug addiction problems, they struggle with their mental health, they have other addiction problems, they're depressed, they're on antidepressants, they're troubled with their psychology for the experiences that they had. To a person, and I make it my business to talk to as many exonerees in the United States as I can, and I'm very close to several organizations in the United States and around the world who have exonerees, who assist exonerees post-release. To a person in the United States, I say, how do you cope with being in prison for 29 years? For instance, to Raymond Towler in Ohio. And he says, it was God's wish. I was on the wrong path. And God wanted this to happen in my life. And when I was in prison, I just helped people as much as I can. And I said, are you not haunted by it every day? Yesterday is gone. God wants me to do the work I'm doing now. And he helps other people in a situation that he was formerly in. And he helps people post-release. And so when I look at this as a sociologist or as a person who was brought up as a Catholic, I can't see any other conclusion than to say that I believe that religion can be emancipatory or is emancipatory. And if I look at it as a sociologist, the two big people I think about are obviously Karl Marx, who talks about religion being the opium of the people. He thinks it's part of some kind of false consciousness. I'd prefer that opium than the kind of opium people are replacing it with, which is real opium, right? If I had to choose an opium. But the other person I think about is Durkheim. Durkheim talks about how human beings need social structure. They need to have some sense of what values they should try to live by as a people, as a society, as a community. So whether you look at this as a sociologist or as a person of faith, I think the conclusion has to be that religion has to be seen as a good thing, because it's something that gives this prerequisite, this necessary sense of a meaningful life, a good life to a people. And one of the questions that Sayed asked at the beginning, I mean, I don't know as much about religion or different religions as you do. But I know this, that, and you ask, should we look at this anthropologically or sociologically? I know that whether we look at this anthropologically or in terms of belief system and sociologically, that wherever we've actually investigated or evaluated a human community or a human society, there's always been the formation of a belief system or religion. And I think that's what people need. And I think that's what's lacking in Britain at the moment, which is the cause of these social ills. And that's as much
Thanks,
as I've got
Mike.
to say.
Thank you very much, Mike. We'll get back to you soon. Okay, Dustin, the floor is yours.
So I just want to pick up on a few things that Mike said. It always occurs to me when we talk about the empty churches, and we have the same issue in the US, especially with Catholicism and the mainline Protestant churches. They're shut down all over the place. The evangelical churches are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, right? But the almost what I call the intellectual churches, the churches that have some kind of tradition behind them. They seem to be dying at a very fast rate. So we have the same issue here, and it's something that I've experienced in Rome, since every year I'm usually in Rome for quite some time. And as someone, this political philosopher walks in and sits in this beautiful Renaissance cathedral for 2-3 hours just in contemplation or writing or something like that, and the only other people I see in there are people who are there to look at the Caravaggio. What I mean? They're there to look at the painting. They're not there for contemplation. They don't really care what's the meaning, the religious meaning behind the Caravaggio scene, right? They're there to see the brushstrokes and the master's, his method, and so it's very clear that in many ways the prediction of Nietzsche is coming true. Right, that these buildings have become what he called the tombs of God. These buildings that are now being turned into bistros and into apartments and flats, like you said, they are in many ways the tombs of God in the West. And that brings up, the political question with political religion on the far right, including in Britain, where they're advocating for a new form or that the West returns to religion, returns to a religious identity as a way not of addressing, the spiritual deficit, spiritual void, if you will, in the West, but as a way of saying, hey, this is us, this is who we are, we're of this identity, we're not of that identity, because it's pretty much against the Muslims, it's against the multiculturalism, it's against the browning of the West, if you will. And so in that sense, you now have the left in many ways saying, hang on a second, we don't want to return to religion because, religion is completely a right-wing thing. Religion is for these regressive people, right? Religion is for the neo-Nazis and whatnot. And I think you put your finger on it, that's maybe one side of religion, but that's not the whole story by any stretch of the imagination, right? And so that other side of religion, which I think you brought up most beautifully, is that emancipatory side at the individual level, at the spiritual level, at the level of healing. That is very much there. But I think a lot of people, especially who are particularly secular or on the left, are afraid of any way associating themselves with religion because it looks like they're joining the conservatives, right? The racists, the fascists, on and on. So that's one thing. Another thing is, you brought up Marx's definition of opium of the masses, which, I always read that, and I read that in a relatively heterodox way. We have this discussion whether Marx was a traditional atheist or not. Was he really, secularized religion? Was he really religious at heart, but, in his manifest content, was he secular, right? I mean, we can have that discussion, but it appears to me, when he says that with the full sentence, that religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of the heartless world, the soul of a soulless condition, it's the opium of the people, right? That now in Western society, in a highly secularized society, we don't even have that sigh anymore, because religion is the sigh. We don't even have the sigh. If religion is the heart of the heartless world, we don't even have the heart. And if it's the soul of a soulless condition, we don't have a soul. I mean, we are left void, just completely void. And within that void, we try to fill it up with consumption, right? And just the buying and more buying and more buying. That's the consumer society. That's where we're supposed to find our meaning, and we don't find meaning in it because it's ticklish happiness, as I call it. It's not eudaimonia, it's ticklish happiness. It's like being tickled. You're laughing, you're happy for a few seconds, but then it dissipates, and you have to go buy something else and start the whole process over again, right? And so, I think Marx has to be relooked at there, and to say, well, maybe maybe religion, like you said, is a better opium than what has replaced it. Because what has replaced it is, like you said, real opium and the masses, right? I mean, if it's the opium of the masses, it was replaced by real opium and the masses, meaning populism. Populism has replaced, in many ways, religion. If you look at, the populist movements in Europe, in the United States with Trumpism, this populism has given people an interpretation of reality, and an orientation of action, which is what religion usually does, right? And into some cases, it blends itself with evangelical Christianity, but in other cases, it's highly secular. I mean, Trump was a highly secular guy, yeah, but he produced a political movement that was a substitute or ersatz religion for a lot of people. All of a sudden, they didn't feel helpless. They didn't feel hopeless, right? The deaths of despair might have leveled off. I don't know that for sure, but you know, the death of despair is people just feel completely hopeless, especially middle-aged white men. Sorry, fellas, right? We're killing ourselves off, you know what I mean, out of hopelessness. But all of a sudden, this movement comes, and like a religion, it fills that void, right? But it's a destructive void, right? It's a destructive movement that fills that void. And so does it have any stay power like religion? I don't know. Will it get worse? Quite possibly. I think it will. But getting back to our main question about religion as a human phenomenon, whether or not it's emancipatory or repressive, I think we all are in agreement that, you know, depending on in what form it takes at what point in time, it certainly is both, right? In a highly secular time, religion can be most prophetic, but in a very religious time, secularism can be most prophetic, right? And so it's one of these dialectical processes that I think when the Frankfurt School, which I come from, the background I come from, looked at religion, they had to reject their own predecessors and their own critique of religion. So they had to reject Feuerbach to a certain extent. They had to determinately negate him, right? They had to determinately negate Marx. They had to determinately negate Nietzsche and Freud, and say, no, religion, there's something within religion, an element within religion that is still very emancipatory. Now, Adorno said that whatever is going to survive of religion in modernity has to be translated into publicly accessible reasoning, to use Habermas's phrase, but it has to be secularized. It has to be brought into the language that it can be publicly debated, right? That it can be accessible to all people who aren't religious. So it escapes that closed semantic universe that it's in. But it might not be the case anymore. I mean, we have to rethink Adorno, whether that is the case, that religion has to be translated into secular language, because we see what secularity can do to everything, right? I mean, in the Authoritarian Personality, they talk about how religion has become neutralized, right, in the secular society. Well, if it's become neutralized in the secular society, you want to really take those religious semantics and semiotics and put it into that same secular language? Won't that neutralize it as well? Right? I mean, it's a possibility, and I think we have to think about. So maybe it is the case in our post-secular condition that we find ourselves in now, that religion has to remain within its own language, within its own garb, so that it can present itself as something other than what is the case. And what is the case is this ugliness, or the totally dark world, as Horkheimer called it, that is causing these suicides and the porno addiction, right? And the death of despair, and this demise in many cases of the Western world. You know, the sickness that's plaguing it in many ways. Now, I don't think religion can be the be all to end all antidote for our issues, right, in the West. And certainly is the case that not all people can return to religion, can be religious, right? I mean, it's gone beyond that. You know, some people are just, there's no way you're going to ever get them to believe in anything outside of the material world, right? You know, to pray is to just talk to yourself, right? Or to talk in a group, right? To yourself, right? You know, in the secular society, there's no angels. Angels aren't a thing. We're religious people, angels are a thing. There's no revelation, no sacred text, you know what I mean, in the secular society, but for there is. And so how do you bridge that gap? That's a hard thing to do. And the only place where I really see that gap being bridged is with people who speak, whether they're secular and or religious, but speak to that, what you talked about, Mike, that suffering condition that so much of the world is going through. And I'm not a how should one say, I'm critical, but I think someone like the Pope, like this.
Where did he go?
I think he got frozen for a second.
Yeah.
I could hear his voice, but the picture was gone. Was
Yes.
frozen.
Yeah.
I think he went to the Pope. He went to see the Pope. But it was, yeah, actually, there was interesting topic he was talking about, and
We
what you
need,
were
we need,
saying.
we need the Pope
You,
to send him back.
yes, he will be back. He
I
will be
have a
back.
proposal. What we can do. We have a small group here. So we could open this. We could continue. Dustin hopefully will come back. I have some comments to make. Havad probably has comments to make as well. But I see a number of participants, so we get more inclusion. What I would say, if you would like to participate, I could promote anyone to a panelist. That way you could see, you could talk and
Yes,
we can have a
please
conversation.
do so.
So actually, what
Please
I'll
do
just
so.
do is I'm going to just promote everyone to a panelist. We have like 9 who are in the audience.
That's
And
good.
then, okay, and then, but we could continue the conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and promote everybody to a panelist. If you don't want to share your screen, don't. But that way we could have a real discussion.
Okay,
If
great.
I'm missing
Please
anybody,
do so.
raise your hand.
And do you have, I mean, if you yourself have any comments, please do so.
Yeah, I do. And I'm just dealing with the technical thing here for the second. Hold on. There's a bunch of clicking here. Give me a minute. So I'm promoting everybody a panelist, so to a panelist, so you can participate. So feel free. You're all muted right now. You could unmute yourself, or I mean, if you're not going to talk, keep it muted because sometimes noises pick up. But share your screens, please. Everybody who wants to participate. Okay.
Okay.
So actually, I'm just going to add my own comments in here too, regarding the discussion. And we lost Dustin, but Dustin's mentor, Rudy Siebert, once called me, I guess, a dialectical Weberian. Let's see. I'm just clicking here still. Sorry, 1 second.
Let me just give a message to,
Yeah,
to
Dustin's
Dustin.
back. He should be back. We lost him. We can let him
Okay.
pick up. Oh, Dustin, there you are. You want to continue?
I did just switch to a different computer. The other one crashed for some reason. But yeah, no, what else? Where did I leave off? Did I start talking about the Pope yet?
Yeah, you were talking about Pope. Then I
Okay.
made a joke when you were gone that you went to the Pope.
Yeah, that's right. I probably did. I usually go see him, you know what I mean? Wednesday mornings when I'm in Rome. So, what gave it away that I disappeared was that Sajjavad had this nice look on his face, like that, and it was frozen. So anyway, I'll wrap it up what I was saying. I was just saying that the Pope Francis of all people, at least in the public eye right now, seems to be the one who's the most effective at talking to both religious and secular people, talking to people who are suffering. Now, whether or not that has any real change in the world, whether or not that has an effect, I don't see that happening. Obviously, we're dealing with global systems here that are causing a lot of these issues. And one man, no matter if he's the head of the Catholic Church or head of a nation, is not going to undo this issue. But in terms of religion and secularity, at least this is someone at a powerful position trying to build bridges as opposed to trying to tear people even further apart, which is what I see happening in most cases, especially within the political realm where religion is involved. So, okay, that's good.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dustin. It was very important, actually, issues. We'll get back to you as well. And now we have the comments of Warren. Warren, please go on.
All right, so Dustin, you missed it, but Rudy Siebert, your mentor, once called me a dialectical Weberian. And this question, this is perhaps, I guess it's informed my thinking how looking at the both, religion as emancipatory and repressive. I kind of look at it through a Weberian framework, but a kind of a dialectical Weberian framework. First, I'm going to make a caveat, and anyone, I'm sure there's some religious studies people in the group here. They're gonna, like, I always hear, I have this religious studies. I've been, I'm a sociologist of religion, but I've been hanging out with the religious studies people a lot in the last several years. And so I always have that religious studies voice in my head. It's like, well, what is religion, right? So, like, talking about religion as emancipatory or repressive is, what is religion? Number one, right? What do you categorize as religion? And I guess the objection from the religious studies camp is that, religion's a Western category, which has been superimposed over non-Western societies. There's actually a modern concept, which is like superimposed over the past. So, one thing we always need to be conscious of, from the critical religion perspective is, what are we talking about when we refer to religion? The problem is that the term religion is oftentimes used way too broadly. Perhaps Durkheim is partly responsible for that. We have secular religions, Marxism is a religion, capitalism is a religion. So, and then, the question is, the category becomes so broad that it perhaps loses any type of substance to it as well. So I'm just with that in the background. But back to the Weberian aspect of it, I look at this kind of through, it's a combination of understanding Weber's Herrschafts, sociology of domination, which is an economy of society, with his sociology of religion, which is also an economy and society. So, for Weber, there's different types of domination, and there's three main categories of domination. There's traditional domination, and there's different types of traditional domination: patriarchal, patrimonial, and there's a third one, but there's also charismatic domination, and there's bureaucratic domination. Bureaucratic domination is obviously for Weber the most rational type of domination. But where this ties into religion is, Weber also has these different opposing types of rationality. There's actually 6 different types of rationality in Weber. There's value and proposive, theoretical and practical, and formal and substantive. And they're all, this is back to the dialectical Weberian. They're kind of these opposing pairs. And the most, I guess, well-known are value and proposive. So, value rationality is when rationality is driven by sets of values. They could be ethical, aesthetic, religious, or any other value. It's like, for example, freedom or democracy or justice. These are all values. And proposive rationality is really, for him, it's a means-oriented type of rationality, appropriate means to a given end. So connecting this with religion, for example, Weber would say that the prophet, right, in the sociology of religion, the prophet is value-driven. And what the priest does is that the priest takes the word of the prophet and interprets the word of prophet, and then it becomes more like kind of an application of these values to concrete cases, for example. So the priest interprets the word of the prophet. But the prophet, is being value-driven, is also charismatic. And if you look at in the sociology of domination, that in terms of the section on charismatic domination, what's most important is he says that charismatic domination is revolutionary. So in other words, prophets, I took classes, Jose Casanova was my mentor at the New School. So charisma is revolutionary and it's value driven. But what happens is, for Weber, it's a question of successorship. So the prophet brings about a new religion, right? Which could be revolutionary, which could be value-based, values of freedom or equality, looking at Nietzsche, for example. And then what happens is, what happens when the charismatic leader dies, or what happens when the prophet dies? The prophet is replaced by the priest, from Moses to Aaron, for example, right? Or you could say, Jesus through his disciples to the church, there becomes an institutionalization of charisma. Charisma becomes routinized, right? So what he also says is that charisma is also, is not every day, außer alltäglich, right? where there's these traditional types of domination which are everyday. So traditional domination is everyday, bureaucratic domination is everyday. So what happens is that kind of this prophetic charisma is revolutionary, right? And it can has the potential to bring to number one, to bring about a new order. So the prophet established as a new order, and the priest institutionalizes it, right? It becomes every day. So there's a question about succession, the routinization of charisma. So what I think, looking at this question through a Weberian framework is prophets have the potential to be revolutionary, charismatic, and to bring about revolutionary change. But what happens is that change becomes institutionalized, it becomes routinized, it becomes back to the everyday. But one thing to understand that these are both different types of domination. Charisma is a type of domination, and traditional domination of the priest is also a type of domination. There's just two different types of domination. But it's a question about the mechanism of the transformation of the society. So, even the relationship between prophets and priests, right? Prophets, like for example, Jesus can challenge the priest class, right? They challenge the existing structure. If the prophet's successful, they establish a new religion, right? And that religion becomes institutionalized. So, I mean, I think a bunch of you are familiar with Weber, and I've worked this out in some of my publications as well. So what I think is that religion in certain contexts, in that prophetic, charismatic context, can be revolutionary and transformative. But it also, but be clear that also could be a type of that's also a type of domination, but it also could be tied up with the established order, and then become routinized and traditionalized. Both types are domination. Back to the question that was raised at the beginning, is I'm very weary. I mean, I'm on the secular side, so I'm always very weary. I think pre-enlightenment, yes, pre-enlightenment religion can play that kind of revolutionary role, but once we have the Enlightenment, the context changes. And I think that one needs to be very cautious. Like even any type of promise of emancipation, I always you have to be very cautious about that. For example, in Iran, right, where Havad is from, we can see how, for example, that the Ayatollah, that revolutionary drive, that revolution also becomes at a certain point can become institutionalized. The Cultural Revolution in Iran, immediately after the revolution, became very repressive, and then it eased up later on. But so that it almost like, and I do have that article on Iran where Iran can follow that case of religion being revolutionary, but then becoming institutionalized and becoming repressive. And this back and forth dynamic between the two of them. So trying to use a theoretical framework to understand this is that yes, religion, forms of religion can play both roles simultaneously at the same time. So I think we need to be very aware of that.
Okay, thank you, Warren. Actually, what you mentioned about Iran, I made a note before. I think we were thinking about the same thing, maybe with different terminologies. I was thinking, think about it, when religion, in terms of power, the position of power and religion, when religion is in conjunction with power, then there are high possibilities of repressiveness. But when the position of religion is in terms of influence, not power, say, for example, religious authorities or religious institutions, they have like cultural domination, or they have cultural way of reaching to people. There it seems, at least in the case of Iran, we see when, for example, if you compare Iran and Iraq, you see, for example, Ayatollah Sistani, he doesn't have any political power, but he has a strong influence on the population. So it seems when we talk about religion, we should think about power as well. how religion and power, especially political power, or in the context of nation state, as you said, for example, when we talk about religion before enlightenment and after enlightenment, or I put it in this way, before nation state and after nation state. When, for example, we have nation state and how, for example, this political power is interplaying with religion. These, it seems, they have different kind of repercussions for religion in terms of its emancipatory power and repressive power. We cannot just leave, for example, sign a blank, for example, check for religion, that religion is always emancipatory and or religion is always repressive. But what Marx said, actually, what Marx said about neoliberalism, I think that is another important question. And it brings into mind that we should think about neoliberalism or the system, capitalist system, in a more critical fashion. Of course, Marxists, neo-Marxists, post-colonial theorists, they have actually been very critical about capitalism as a system, neoliberalism as a way of life, which seems as some kind of characteristic of, say, religion as well. But then again, here I'm thinking about, imagine, for example, in England or maybe in US, you don't have religion in power, but in Iran you have religion in power. But again, you have here, for example, many people who are drug addicted, or the drug addiction is rising. Many, for example, social ills are on rise. So why is it like that? In England, we don't have religion in power, but here we have religion in power. What is happening that when you have even religion in power, then you have social ills as well? So I think we need to be more, I mean, we need to problematize the relation between power and religion, and the issue of secularity and religiosity, repressiveness and emancipatory, more, I mean, deeper. Thanks. So Warren, if there are any other participants who are interested to get into the debate.
So everyone now is a panelist. Feel free to talk. Unmute yourself and speak up. I'm not really controlling it anymore.
Because here I cannot see the name. Hello, Mehdi.
Good morning. At least it's here. Good morning here. How are you guys? Good to see you all.
Yes, go on, Mehdi.
I think that either we can look at religion as at the level of individual, how I relate to a supernatural, a creator, and what's in it for me, based on my inheritance, what I've learned from my society, who I think I am, and also at the level of a structure. I think, for instance, in the case of Michael, you mentioned Catholicism. You know, I did a little bit of a study of Catholicism, the whole history of Christendom, the oppressive power of the Pope and the Church, and then the plunder, and on and on and on. On the other hand, we see that in the same religion there are that rise up and protest that and object to that and began a campaign to overcome that kind of oppression. In many ways, what Warren said about routinization of charisma, in fact, that is even been challenged in some cases, like in Latin America, liberation theology. I like to think that within all these religions, we don't have to go to the other side, what's called the so-called secular line of thinking. Within these religions, there are forces that have always been, in many ways, on the side of the people, not on the side of the establishment, oppressive establishments. That is the Ali Shariati's thesis, religion versus religion. That he instead of looking at class struggle, he looks at all these religions, the struggle within Judaism, within Christianity, within Islam, as a way of moving the society forward. And you know, Christianity as well as Islam and Judaism have always had a group of people in charge, in control of power. And when we talk about power, it's not some abstract notion. Obviously, we're talking about economic power, social power, even power at the level of individual, dictating to things to individuals. And we have a history of, class structure of society. The dominant classes of society have always found an easy marriage of convenience with religion in order to get the masses to submit to their will. I remember not too long ago, I read a paper called Let There Be Market. That's very interesting observation. Let there be market, let there be light, let there be market. Here's that how Christian fundamentalists in America in particular, in many ways, gear their theology towards, sort of enabling capitalism to expand, market forces to expand. It wasn't a question of justice. No. The question is competition. God has given everybody equal power. Therefore, you got to compete. And if you made it, God bless you. If not, that's just too bad, you loser. That's the attitude. So, in other words, in many ways, that's what market says. That's what market capitalism is. Speaking of, neoliberalism, that's nothing new, really. The private economic power has always been trying to control the state as well as the other institutions in society, routinized or otherwise. And I think that when we talk about where we are right now, whether religion is liberating or emancipatory, I think we need to look at the history of the development of this religion, and we see historical epochs in which religion has allied itself with the oppressive power, and there are people on the side that have always struggled against that kind of oppressive behavior. So I think it could go either way, really. At the level of individual, maybe there are some spiritual meaning for me. I can feel comfortable. There is solace for me. But at the level of structure, if nothing changes, then how do I go beyond that? You know what I mean? As a material being, as a human being in society in needs of things. So my point is that spirituality goes so far. We have in Islam, there is a thing called if those who don't have the material well-being, they don't have really a sort of spiritual well-being. So in other words, that's one tied up to the other one. And so at the level of individual, we can think in terms of dialectical process, individual, society, individual, and you can take any approach, but what is really important is that if we were to interpret the text, but I don't know who we are, if we were to interpret the text as a way that conveys some meaningful message to people that religion is here to liberate you, as opposed to a religion here to become the opiate, someone that can provide a false solace. Anyways, so I thought it was interesting that what you said about dialectical Weberia. I've never heard of that one. I've heard of the concept of authority, which is routinization of charisma, then becomes sort of an authority that people accept that, as opposed to sort of power. I think Weber was trying to distinguish between the two, but I think and Weber in many ways falls in the same trap, really, when it comes to cross-cultural analysis of religion. There is that Eurocentrism also within Weber. But by the way, I'm working on a little piece about that. But anyways, that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mehdi. James, if you would like to contribute, we are here to hear you.
I've got questions, but I wasn't expecting to ask a question. I think there was a question in the comments. You read mine. I can say something, but I think it's probably fair that the other question goes first from someone who had a question planned out.
Go on.
Or should I go on? Oh, June.
I guess there are other questions. I think James wants to go give the room to somebody else, right?
Yeah, I can ask a question if you want a question, but I just didn't want to.
Please, go on. Wonderful. Go on.
Oh, okay. Something that Michael said about the differences between what he experienced in America and the UK about kind of drifting away and no community and nothing there, and this whole despairing view. I wonder if this qualify that a little bit, because it seems to be that the changes in religion in the UK and elsewhere in Europe, and I think even to some extent in the States, has been not a shift from religion as such, but a change of the types of religion. So, you know, the church attendance and so on has been in decline, and it's not been replaced by atheism or not, but more a range of just beliefs in, you know, guardian angels, not attending church, praying to God, but not community affiliated in any strong sense, you know, not with a church community around them or anything like that. And maybe that's the difference between some of the examples in the States and what you get in the UK, that there isn't a strong communal way, or there is a declining communal way of understanding religion now. It becomes much more personalized and so on.
Thanks, James. One, Mike.
Hold on. Is it? Yeah. I'm not very good at answering questions. Every time I try and answer a question, people tell me I should be a politician. But I'll try and answer the question like I always try.
Is that a compliment or what? Is that?
They forced me to ask a question. That's why.
I think it's. Hello. Is it work? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I do. One.
I don't know. I mean, for me, I know that when we did a census in the UK, and there was a big campaign for our most recent census, and people were saying, if you don't practice a faith, if you don't regularly go to church, don't write on the census that you're a Christian, okay, or that you are Church of England, because the campaign was concerned that when people just simply write on because people conflate, I'm English, I'm a Christian, all right? I have the same values of Christianity, therefore I am a Christian. So when you look at the census, you get quite a high kind of number of people who claim to be Christians. And people were saying, well, this then feeds into governmental spending, allocation of resources, into faith-based initiatives and endeavors, which we really shouldn't be having, because we're not a Christian society, was the argument. We're a secular society, and people just don't want to say that they're secular or non-religious. But I think that, for me, I would actually say that to be a Christian or to be a Catholic, you have to be practicing your faith. It's not just that you were born in England and your grandparents practiced the faith, therefore you are a Christian. That's what I'd say. But I think that there's been so many ideas with just a few people speaking. My head's just spinning with ideas. In terms of what Dustin was saying, I don't think that we need to artificially go out and try to recreate a religious order, because you or I might actually think that that is good for society, like sociologically or individually. I think that it will happen organically. And I think that when we see, if we were to kind of continue this audit of society and not simply look at inverted commas negative aspects or phenomena like drug addiction, gambling addiction, suicide, those kind of things. If we also look at the other side of the coin, we do see a lot of, is it James?
Yeah.
I don't know if James if this is what James was speaking to. We do see lots of like joining social movements, looking to fill that void through joining Black Lives Matters or a feminist movement or a social class movement, trying to fill that. I'd say there's very much liberation theology going on, because when you look at the values that are being espoused within these social movements to do with justice, equality, freedom, etc., the origins of those ideas, those values, they come from Christianity, as far as I can see. One of my colleagues at the University of Bristol, He's a professor of biblical law, and he wrote a book called God, Justice and Society. And it's a fabulous book if ever you're going to go on summer holiday, because if you have the book next to your sunbed, nobody will bother you in the entire holiday. Nobody will come up and talk to you when they see this book. But anyway, the serious point to make is that when Jonathan looks at contemporary criminal law and criminal justice within the UK, he identifies that every single criminal law that we have is at its core, in terms of its values, something which is grounded in Christianity, in the Christian sense of what is a good thing, what is a bad thing, what is right, what is wrong, what is just, what is unjust. So it's commonsensical in a sense with Christianity, but that's not apparent. And those who practice, espouse, follow, advocate for the rule of law, they don't ever see that actually what they're actually practicing in terms of values is very much a kind of Christian way. You know, we have Sharia law, we have canonical law. There's these different kind of systems, but in a general sense, the secular law of our society is grounded in religion. And despite the fact that we've got these inverted commas negative expressions of I think people are lost, we also have an awful lot of really good things going on, like in my own little world, you know, movements against the wrongful conviction of factually innocent people. And I wrote a chapter with Jonathan Burnside about how, you know, miscarriages of justice and the trials of Jesus, and did a kind of biblical analysis of even the roots of miscarriage of justice, why we think it's wrong that innocent people are wrongly convicted in that way. Power, I have to say something about power and then I'll shut up. I don't think that all power needs to be seen or should be seen as domination. And I'm not sure that even should be seen in terms of repression or emancipation. Power as a phenomenon, I'm more Foucauldian about power. Power just is everywhere. It's in all social relationships. And, you know, it's asociological, I think, to say that all power is about domination, that we could influence or encourage or want to exercise power. There's a positive way. It's not all negative ways. Like the question that you set today, Sayed. You know, is it repressive or emancipatory? Well, it can be both. It can be neither. It depends. But I think power is always present. And I think we need to go beyond thinking about power merely in terms of repression or domination. And it's a more benign thing. It just is within all of these relationships, I think. I've now forgotten all my other questions, so I'll just be quiet.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Mike. I will get back to your point about the failing of neoliberal system, and later on. We have here Julia Martinez. Julia, are you ready to join us? No,
Julia needs to
she's not
unmute.
ready. And there was Aydin as well. Aydin Suer. I'm here, but I can't turn on the camera. Sorry. Okay. Is it like technical problem or no? You mean?
So everyone should be able to talk, or so you need to unmute the unmute button and also like share your video so we can see and hear.
Okay. No. She doesn't want to turn on the camera because it's not technical. It's like she's not good. Okay. What about Aydin Suer? I see his name as well. Aydin Suer. And Mastura. Mastura, are you going to join us? Mastura Latas.
Hello, everybody. I'm here.
Hello, Mastura.
Hello.
Yeah, you said something about hijab. I think it's very appropriate if you bring it on, and I mean bring it up, and we can discuss that as well. About, is it repressive, is it liberative, is it emancipatory?
I think I put the question in the chat if everybody can see, and I will leave it to the experts to answer. And of course, I will leave it to others to ask other questions too. Okay, so
okay.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. At least I can say a few words about this question. I remember in the beginning of the revolution, hijab in Iran was a sign of like emancipatory or a sign of actually liberation. And they were trying to say that this actually gives a sense of liberation from the oppression of like non-religious, for example, propaganda or ideologies. But it's very strange that by the time passing from the revolution in 1979, we see that now there is another trend, that hijab itself becomes a sign of like oppression. Why? Yeah, oppression. Why? Because some women may argue that this is because it has turned into some kind of law, and if you don't wear hijab, it's like you are violating the law and like.
Well, in my essay, I say that the veil, the hijab, was not invented by a woman.
Right.
So so this is the main reason why it cannot be seen as emancipatory for women per se if it was not invented by women. But of course, women say it is emancipatory for other reasons, because maybe they are defending themselves against the criticism that, oh, you are oppressed. It's a very Western. It's captive to they see themselves always in constant dialogue and in relation with Western critique of them. That's one reason, maybe.
Yeah.
And another thing I notice is that Indonesia and Malaysia are often, these are countries with very, very large Muslim populations, but the transformation to the hijab over maybe just barely 1 decade is often, it's a silent transformation. Women went almost in over a few years from not wearing the veil to wearing the hijab. And again, in Malaysia and Indonesia, women were wearing it and taking it off. It was a question of style. I mean, we all do this. But the second we say that, no, it has to be a fixed symbol, then we bring religion into it.
Or power, actually. Yeah, yes, power relation, really. Well, just a couple, if I may, can I speak a couple minutes to this? First of all, it's my understanding in Islam, hijab is not mandatory. It's a matter of choice. That's one thing.
Well, there's an endless debate on this.
Well, yes. But notice, though, those who define what womanhood is are primarily men in some of these societies. In order to control women, therefore, hijab becomes mandatory. I tell you what you should look like when you go outside, even inside the home. I mean, you hear that over, perhaps not in all parts of society, but certainly a segment of society that can exert that kind of pressure.
But women will say, never mind, it gives us freedom. We can go out of the house, we can work, it gives us jobs. So, women will say it is emancipatory.
Yes, that's fine if it's a matter of choice for them. That's what I'm saying. If, however, it's a matter of, you see, in Iran, we went through 2 periods. One was during the Reza Shah, who forcefully removed hijab from women's, scarves from women's head. And then, of course, now that is mandatory. So there is this duality, historically speaking, but also contemporaneously, there is this duality. Iranian women feel like they have to act and look different outside of home than they do inside the house. Now, I don't know this extent of it. Yeah, however, I think one of the issues is that we have to look at instruments of control. And I think that as far as women are concerned, that is one instrument of control, right? However, some women may consider that to be a liberating thing, emancipatory.
Okay, go, Mike. Yeah, go on.
Just responding to something that you said then, Mehdi, it's this idea about, I just think it's too strong, this idea about control and choice. I think that if we take a kind of very straightforward sociological approach, there's no such thing as choice outside of social structure, outside of social context. So I always say to people, you know, in this country, I'm old enough now to remember that 40 years ago, okay, the kind of what we were being told as a society, for instance, about childbirth, for instance, not that I know that much about childbirth, but we were being told that childbirth, women didn't want men or the medical institutions establishment to be anything to do with it, that natural births was the way forward, and that women didn't need to be controlled by men, thank you very much. 40 years on, okay, there seems to be this kind of overwhelming choice now for women when they're having childbirth to have cesarean section. So you say to people, you know, more simple things, you know, when we're given a choice, why do we all dress the same? You know, these very straightforward things. So why do women now choose, inverted commas, to have a cesarean section? And the same could apply. Why are women choosing to wear or not wear the hijab? It's not a free choice. It's something which is promoted within society, that we've gone now from 40 years ago, men keep away, it's not men's business, to now women going into hospital a couple of days before their due date, they have their cesarean in the morning and they're out at lunchtime. Because the medical profession doesn't want women in labour for 40 hours. It's messy, it's costly. It stops the surgeons being able to play golf in the afternoon when they've arranged to play golf with their friends. It costs less money. And so we think our choices are free, but our choices are not free. I say to students, you know, why are you at university? I chose to come to university. Fine, but could you have really chosen otherwise? Because if you would have chosen otherwise, it would have been a bad or a wrong choice. If something's a bad or a wrong choice, it's not really a possible choice. It's something that you're obliged to do. Otherwise, you're a fool. So when we're thinking about choices, we just have to contextualize them within these broader discourses. And like the question that you've set today, it can be either interpreted one way or the other, depending on where you're getting your influences from, where you're getting your messages from. If it's mainstream media, or is it some kind of alternative sources? But when you look at a society, any society, the majority will be actually choosing freely the same thing.
I'd like to, I guess Havan mentioned it earlier, but about power. But I like to look at it, bring it up in, I guess, a slightly different angle regards to this question, and that is the state. The question is the relationship of religion or established religion to the state. What I guess my next editorial for critical research on religion is going to be on the religious and secular state, take a position on that. And I think in that editorial, I'm going to contrast both Iran and Israel, which seem to be kind of parallel players, both having problems with separation of state and religion. So I think, you know, even historically, you know, I was thinking about this, even in you know, Judaism or Christianity, you know, King David, for example. I mean, there was very much in antiquity a connection between state, you know, state religion, between religion and the state. And when religion, as you know, as it becomes connected with state power, then it can be very much a source of control. I think also the secular state is oftentimes, at least from the religious right, is misunderstood, and maybe some of my critical theory colleagues will criticize me for this, but and here I hate to say that, but I'm in agreement with rational choice theory, where is that when there's a secular state, it's really about separation of church and state. It's not that the state is really secular, it's just that the state does not align itself with any particular denomination. Here in the US, we use denominations, but the state doesn't align itself with any particular group. There's in the US, there's this history of this, and there's a book by Philip Hamburger about separation in church and state, but it was originally Thomas Jefferson making alliances with the Baptists and the Methodists in the South against, the Congregationalists and Episcopalians, and I think maybe Presbyterians, the established mainline religions. But it was actually the frontier churches, the Baptists and the Methodists, who were opposed to, places like Massachusetts, where I live. It was a congregational church. It was a state. I mean, even after the establishment of the Constitution, they collected taxes through the state. And the frontier churches were very much opposed to that. Jefferson was more of a secularist, a deist. So there was this alliance, but the whole separation of church and state was, they were all Protestant, but they didn't really want any particular Protestant denomination to become, connected with the state, power to tax, for example. So I think the danger is that when religion becomes connected, when there's state religion, which historically existed, Christian states, for example, in Europe, and the problem with anti-Semitism is that the Jews were subject to these Christian states and didn't have the same rights as Christians because Christianity was the religion of the state. But you could also look at this on perhaps a smaller, more micro level. I'm thinking about, on a smaller level, churches very much. Cults, for example, they're not state religion, but they can be completely oppressive forms of a domination. So I think we also need to look at the relationship. I mean, it's a question of religion and power, but religion and state power, or perhaps religion on a more micro level to some type of collective power over the collective.
Just to jump in, to bring these two issues together about the hijab and the state, clearly when you look at the Iranian Revolution in 1979, and in Warren, I wrote a book about prophetic charisma and Ayatollah Khomeini, and but you see that after the success of the actual overthrow of the Shah, that this state under the new government becomes very defensive and has to craft this identity, this Iranian identity. And part of that is the wearing of hijab or the shadur, right? And so that becomes something mandatory. On the other flip side of that secular states can get involved with religion too, but not by imposing religion, but by opposing religion. So you see that going on in France right now, right, with the laïcité, right? This wherein, if you're a Muslim woman and you want to maintain some kind of modesty and go to the beach in a burkini, you're going to have the police there to take you out of it, right? Where freedom is defined as not having the right to wear the hijab, right? So again, it's another state power in this case that is defining what freedom is for women, whether it's to put on the hijab or shadur in Iran, or the vice versa in the historic Republic of Freedom, France, where they're telling Muslim women, you can't wear this, right? And so I think ultimately that issue is about autonomy and heteronomy. Do you have the autonomy to wear it if you want to, and take it off if you want to? We have that. That's one of the good things I would say about the U.S. That is very much there. Like you were talking about, the state doesn't align with any denominations. The state doesn't care if you wear shadur, if you wear hijab, if you wear niqab. It does not care. So I had a good friend from Egypt who moved here to do his Ph.D. to Kalamazoo at Western Michigan University, and his wife wore hijab in Egypt, but when she got here, she wanted to do what the Romans do, and that is take off the hijab. And within, she felt very liberated taking it off when she got here. A month later, she was wearing kind of a big hat, and I'd noticed that. I didn't really say anything. Within a couple months of being here, she was back in her hijab. And I asked her at dinner, like, why are you wearing hijab again? I thought this was kind of a liberating experience. She's like, I just got sick and tired of people commenting on my looks. They weren't dealing with me. They were dealing with my appearance. They weren't dealing with my intellect, right? And so for her, she said, I put this on to make a statement. You were going to deal with me as a person, as an intellect, as a personality, as an individual, not as my body, right? And so for her, she had the autonomy to be able to make that statement. And that, I think, is what's missing in the case of France or Saudi Arabia or Iran right now.
Yeah, that's right.
So,
that's right.
Can I ask a question? So French laws are based on consent, are they not, of the population?
Yeah, technically.
Right. I mean, historically. And there is this belief that we don't want to dictate things to individual based on these laws. In other words, within French society, you, based on their experience, you should not make religious statements publicly.
Right. The laicite form of secularism.
Correct.
The state has the responsibility to protect the public from undue exposure to
Right. But in the case of Iran, if some woman decides to go out without hijab, the person is not making a religious statement.
Right.
It's a matter of personal statement, right?
So they lack the autonomy to make the statement.
However, yeah, if somebody came from Britain, France, and Iran, and without wearing that hijab, of course, they wouldn't let her in the airport, kill her out of the airport. So again, that is really a small part of a larger issue, I think. Yeah, to what extent the state has the right to intervene in the personal life of individuals, collective, and what's the purpose of that, right? The purpose. What's the purpose of that? If the French government does that to protect the rights of individuals, what is it that the Iranian government is doing by doing so? Or Saudi Arabia or whatever, right? So what are we? Where do we locate this? You know, we distinguish between the context, the political, economic, you know, social, cultural, but then where do we locate this issue? Hijab. I mean, when I say a matter of choice, you know, well, certainly that should be, I don't have a choice to go 100 miles an hour on the street. No, because that endangers what? That causes problem for the rest of society, creates utter chaos. If everybody were to disregard these things, might go according to their choice. But in the case of hijab, or the way I dress, yes, there are community norms. We have that in the States, right? I mean, I think every society has community norms. I cannot just go out any way I want, right? There are certain limitations. There are certain boundaries that I have to respect. But then again, it's the question of what does that mean for the larger society? For me, not to go out any way I want is because of the respect for the rights of others. Can we say the same thing about hijab? You see, I guess that's the issue. And why is that so important if we have 40% of the population out of work, hungry? What are the priorities? You see, and so, and I think, you know, when it comes to religion being the opium of the masses, you can look at it this way, that there is this utter desperation that there is nowhere else to turn except drugs, like Michael said, drugs and alcohol, right? Because that religion is not even satisfying, right? In some cases, not always, of course. But anyway, I don't know. It's just that to me, it's not an unresolved issue, matter of personal choice versus structural, I guess, imperatives or social norms, whatever you want to call it. We have to decide.
But part of the thing, you know, when Warren said at the very beginning that it depends on, you know, the context, the time period, things like that. Religion can, you know, either be the opiate of the masses, or what Marx and Engels also saw, it can be
antidote. Yeah.
To use a modern phrase, it could be the Viagra of the masses as well. right?
Yeah.
I mean, they did write about the peasants' revolt and Thomas Munzer, right? And what motivated that was, of course, religion. And they actually looked at it and very much approved of what they were trying to do, right? And you have that same thing today in American history. You know, most people look at someone like John Brown, right, this radical abolitionist, and they call him a fanatic. Right? Well, okay, well, yeah, he was a fanatic, but we immediately assume fanaticism is a bad thing.
Right.
But fanatics are oftentimes good people, right? Like John Brown was a good fanatic. I mean, he was 100% dedicated to the overthrow of the institution of slavery. You needed more fanatics at that time period, because at that time period, the abolitionists, by and large, we're going to pray for it, right? We're going to write about it. You know what I mean? But John Brown actually did something about it. He was a fanatic, right? And so, you know, in that sense, it always depends with religion, whether it's dulling the masses, dulling the senses, as Kant calls religion, or sharpening the consciousness, as Kant calls it, right? That religion can also do the same. And he calls one of them bad and one of them good, right? The one that sharpens the consciousness is good religion, and the one that dulls the consciousness is bad religion. That's in a footnote in the Religion Beyond, or Religion Within the Bounds of Mere Reason.
And this feeds into something that we talked in a previous session for me, because it's, you know, we can see these ills of society, of Western societies, you know, this kind of hopelessness, you might say. And I think Durkheim's could be important there in terms of Durkheim's methodology or categorization of different reasons for suicide, or Merton's kind of application of Durkheim's framework to strain and crime, etc. And, you know, you could see this kind of fatalism. There certainly seems to be a sizable proportion of the population in the UK that are acting in an almost fatalistic way, in a Durkheimian sense. You know, they've kind of, there's no guidelines, there's no framework, and they just resigned to either killing themselves quickly with suicide. It seems to me record numbers of suicide, predominantly young men, or slow suicide by these other destructive things. I've always found it quite interesting that we see self-harm quite readily if somebody's slashing their wrists or whatever. But we don't see somebody who's binge drinking for 25 years or gambling their money away or working themselves to death as self-harm in the same way. But there are these strategies, you know, and we can see these as negative things. Or to link up with something was Sayed was talking about earlier, about thinking about neoliberalism as a kind of, as a mythology, as a belief system that's clearly failing a sizable amount of people. And if religions emerge organically rather than imposed, you know, if they're going to have any kind of longevity or any meaningfulness in a kind of individual or spiritual sense, it has to be something that you choose, right? So you'd have to say that neoliberalism is a busted flush. Even people who are millionaires have realized that, unlike what, you know, the Beatles knew it, money can't buy you love. So money can't buy you happiness either. And once we get above a certain level of need, this is Maslow's hierarchy of need, and we've got our basic kind of material needs catered for, shelter, food, clothing, whatever. We can elevate ourselves to wanting much more than just the pursuit of more and more and more and more and more and more and more. I feel quite lucky that I'm actually the white sheep of my family, but we're the kind of poor relation of my wife's family. And I'm kind of right in the middle where if I'm to compare myself at all with my own family, I've done, you know, far better than someone like me deserves. What's up? My wife brought me a cup of tea. That is true repression, right? and emancipation for me. But
true love. It's true love.
35 years and counting, it must be. But I remember I was out with a relative of my wife's, and we were on this super yacht in the south of France, and it was a wonderful day for my children. They were very young, and I went up to this person and I said, "Thank you so much for inviting us onto your super yacht today. Several millions of pounds 20 years ago." I said, "My kids have just had the day of their life playing on these toys in the water and having this experience, and I'm grateful for that." And he was just looking out across the marina, and he wasn't listening to me or engaging with me. And I said, "Are you listening to what I'm saying? I'm saying thank you for a wonderful day." And he just looked at me and said, "Yeah, but it's not that, is it?" And he was looking at a 20 million pound yacht, and he thought what he had was rubbish and just not good enough. And all he could see was this thing that he thought was better, that he wanted to possess. And Said and I have been talking recently about Paulo Freire, and also he educated me about Eric Fromm, about how the world can be divided into the kind of people who want to possess things or have things, and people who are just more about trying to, be the best that they can be. And I think there's an increasing number of people. I do feel hopeful that the more that neoliberalism fails to deliver on its sociological promise and its psychological promise of leading to heaven on earth, happiness, etc. Pure hedonism, that's all you need. It's clearly failing in that, which gives me hope that something will emerge from that, which will actually be a counter to that, where there's a move from the possessing desire to more about realizing that what's really important in life is, once you've got a certain level of material security, it's about relationships, love, it's about helping people if you can help people, and being the best that you can be in terms of the values that I was brought up with from my Catholic perspective.
I'd like to touch on what Dustin said before. We lost Savada. Hopefully he'll come back. It's interesting that you brought up Munzer, Thomas Munzer, on Engel's writings on the German peasant wars. This is one of my concerns, and I may like to provoke James in here, because I think this kind of gets along some of the lines of his Center for Millenarianism and Apocalyptic Research. I don't know the exact name, but along those lines, that the German peasant wars were completely bloody. And Munzer, the peasants got slaughtered. It's in the it's in the description of there. They got their asses kicked. It was completely bloody affair. Munzer got caught and was tortured and killed, stretched on the rack and killed. Another example of is the Taiping Rebellion. I can never pronounce his name. Hang Xiaoxing. Is that the bloodiest civil war was the Taiping Rebellion. Hang thought he was the younger brother of Jesus, and he led the Hakka into a revolt against the Manchus, in the north. The estimates are between 20 and 40 million people were killed. Chinese were killed in the Taiping Rebellion. He established his heavenly kingdom in Nanjing, and he was crazy. He was influenced by this Tennessee Baptist preacher, Zachary Roberts, who later thought he was a complete madman, and he was, and it was a completely bloody. So I think, when I was younger, I used to more romanticize about revolution, but I think we need to be quite sanguine about revolutions. To use Malcolm X, revolutions is not begging for integrated cup of coffee. Revolutions are based upon bloodshed. There are nonviolent revolutions. Gandhi is perhaps a better example. Wasn't completely nonviolent either, but So we need to be really cautious. I think, because religion as this emancipatory vehicle can also turn into an instrument of violence and bloodshed. And so, this type of romanticism about, I think Dustin used the word fanatics, but this romanticism, Jim Jones. So we need to be really cautious about this dual nature of this flip side of emancipation and repression. So James, did I provoke you here on millenarian movements and apocalyptic movements?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess a lot to be said about it. Like with religion, millenarianism can go in any number of directions, from the fanatic we don't like to the fanatic we might like. On the bloody nature of revolutions, I would kind of so sometimes you take a step back on this and be a little detached. I mean, what if you look at my favorite example of uprising is the 1381 so-called Peasants' Revolt, or there's the 17th century English Revolution. And I get what you're saying, Warren, of course, but I think in one sense, who am I to say that this shouldn't have been a violent uprising? You've got decades of clashing over labour scarcity and wages and things like this, and a pretty oppressive poll tax. Something's got to give, and something does give, and it does end up in a bloody uprising, justified in religious terms and biblical terms and things like that. Now, that's where I start to think, well, I can explain it and I understand why it had to happen, but I get a bit uneasy about where saying it should or shouldn't be the case, because it becomes a bit of a problem. I get the romanticizing of it, but I get the romanticizing in another way, is that if these things are going to happen, if you are going to overturn a system, whether it's the English aristocracy at the time, or whether it's the pre-Soviet Union Russia, no one's going to just step back and say, go ahead, lads, and impose your will. We're going to just roll over. It will take, it's going to take sacrifice at some level to do these kinds of things. So I think you're right, it shouldn't be romanticized. You can end up with a Jim Jones level, but there's also a realism to this kind of thing, that these things will happen if your position is to overthrow something as dominant as an existing ideology and system and so on.
Let me also just, just to top this off a little bit, I know some of you are sociologists, some of you are more like biblical studies, religious studies, but Charles Tilley has a book on social movements, and there's a statement in there which really kind of, and it has to do with the Enlightenment too. And it also is contextualized in the difference between, for example, Taiping or the Puritan Revolution, or John Ball, is that he argues once you have the establishment of a republic, right? Once you have some type of semblance of democracy, that social movements themselves emerge along with the republic. So like democratic movements. So the point what he makes is that successful revolutions only either occur under dictatorships or monarchies. There has never been a successful revolution which has occurred under a republic. And the reason is because republics flex, right? Social movements create pressure. I mean, I'm not talking about, there's degrees of democracy, degrees of input. But when a social movement, if the state is somewhat democratic, the state will reform. The social movement creates pressure to reform the state. But revolutions only occur when there's complete obstruction, right? The system is not flexible. It doesn't, like, when there's pressure that builds up, it doesn't adjust to that pressure. So in such cases of dictatorships or monarchies. So I think that's important to understand in context. So in pre-Enlightenment, where you don't have a republic, right, then these religious I would say in a pre-Enlightenment context, yes, religion can play this revolutionary role, but in the modern state, a modern republic, it's only social movement. I mean, the revolutions aren't successful. And it's only social movements which create pressure on the state to change, and the state will flex as a result of that. So in a pre-Enlightenment context, yes, religion does play this revolutionary role, but in the modern context, it's quite different. It would need to take the form of a social movement.
The exception to that would, of course, would be when these republics have colonies. Because in the colonies, those revolutions can work, and they often did, right?
Right.
You know, so I mean, it's the same. You know, the structure that is in place in the metropole is not at the same place in place in the colony. So that point is true. I think it's also important when we look at, you know, people that I'm calling fanatics, that we look at them from the perspective within the class structure of which the fanatic is operating in. So if you look at in 1831, Nat Turner, in Northampton County, Virginia, right, leads the largest quote unquote successful slave uprising, right? And of course, he's called a fanatic. He's called fanatic by whites in the South. He's called a fanatic by whites in the North. He thought he was sent by God to emancipate people. But who didn't call him a fanatic were the slaves, right? Those who were on the ass end of the society, right? Same thing with John Brown, right? He was called a fanatic by people who wanted to maintain slavery, and he was called a fanatic by other abolitionists. But no slave ever called him a fanatic in a pejorative way, right? He was the emancipator. In fact, he was the emancipator before the quote unquote great emancipator of Abe Lincoln, right? And so it's always important, I think, that the fanatic, when we label someone a fanatic, we have to see like who's behind that label. What's their intention of labeling someone a fanatic? You know, so again, I remember having a conversation about Khomeini with one of my colleagues, and they just said he's a fanatic. And it's like, and it's just a way of brushing him off, right? It was like, okay, yeah, but what was he about? You know what I mean? You know, if we reverse the situation and Iran did to America what America did to Iran, would we call the figurehead of the movement to liberate themselves from that a fanatic? You know what I mean? Maybe we would, but maybe the fanatic's a good thing in that position, right?
Just a thought. I think fanaticism, labeling somebody a fanatic, is a Western creation. I don't remember. Of course, recently, I think we hear in Iran, in the case of Iran, a group of people who are, for some reason, call themselves principled, or those who are advocating going back to the principles. They have some notions about what principles are and what they mean in the current context, or if there are sort of a normative or foundational set of beliefs. It's up to them to define, because I haven't heard any definition. But anybody who opposes the establishment in Iran is the other side. Is on the other side, not on the other side of the foundational or principled individuals. So I think that fanaticism implies sort of, it's a degrading, dehumanizing concept that is used. Any kind of violence, or was considered to be violent, any kinds of uprising, any kind of rejection of the status quo is considered to be fanatic, which is not shared by a great number of people. I think John Brown, for instance, you know, not too long ago, by the way, his statues around here was they found some graffiti there. But so is this the notion of consumption of history, you know, in the current context? But I think fanaticism is a Western creation. I don't know if any other culture really. I think Khaldun has a concept of asaba. Asaba in many ways has been translated as fanatic, belonging. What Khaldun meant, of course, means having a sense of belonging to the larger community, which is completely different than the fanaticism that is used, the concept that is used in the West.
There's a long history of this, in one sense, that religion, or excessive religion, and I think it backs up the idea that it's likely a Western creation, is that religion is, or excessive religion is fanaticism in some way, then that gets secularized to deal with any illiberal opponent. So it's the rational liberal center, and the left-right wildness outside of that is the fanaticism to be equated with excessive religion. And what we saw in the UK in the past 5 years is with Jeremy Corbyn, was constantly classified as cult, sectarian, fanatic, apocalypticist, and all this kind of thing, in contrast to the sort of liberal Guardian reading centre or whatever, or sort of liberal leftish vaguish center-right consensus. But this was just really relentlessly, almost daily, to use this kind of language. You're like the religious nutters kind of thing. And I think there's a long tradition of this, certainly in the UK and probably elsewhere in Europe and the West. And I think it very likely is a Western.
And they still use the fanaticism, but they still, this is interesting. People don't know this very often, is that we still use the word fanaticism on a daily basis was something that has nothing to do with religion per se, unless we extend the meaning of religion like Warren was talking about. In that if we're a particular supporter of a sports team, we're called a fan, which is just the shortening of the word fanatic. Right. So in that sense, if you're a fan, that's not necessarily a bad thing. But if you use the whole term of fanatic, that's pejorative. Right. If it's religion, you're a fanatic. If it's hockey, I'm rooting for Boston, Warren. Then that's okay. That's rational. You can be a fanatic for a sports team.
But you can't talk about any of this unless you're going to contextualize it within notions of power relations, because you talked about power earlier, and these labels are only to be understood within that context. So in the UK, as James will know as well, that anybody who wants to try to go up against, in some way, resist or challenge the existing arrangement, status quo, whatever, is thought of as an enemy of the state, or as you talked about Jeremy Corbyn, the kind of treatment that Jeremy Corbyn got, which was totally off the scale and totally untrue. But it doesn't matter if it's true or it's not true, does it? It matters if people believe what's being said, and then the power of that discourse in determining how people think, how they feel, and then how they act. So it's all about power. And these labels are very, very effective at making people think and feel and act in certain ways. So it's discursive power. And there's not much you can do about it, because those with the power to so label will so label. And then the machinery just goes into operation. And just reaffirms all of that.
With 1 foot in economics, I've been thinking about this whole notion of, religious, the institution of religion in certain societies in cahoots with the economic power. I'm thinking, there got to be a relationship between religion and the regimes of accumulation of capital, that it seems that it adjusts itself based on the imperatives of accumulation. I think if we were to just plug that in, I don't know, I've been thinking about this, I have some notes, but to look at the larger global context, I think all of these things will fall into the place. Regime of accumulation. What does it take for capital to be accumulated? What are the mechanisms by which capital can use to accumulate? And what are the characteristics of regime at different historical epochs? I think that would be something I think we can address a lot of issues across religions.
I
just want to step in for a second. Hello. I'm not quite sure about Zoom. I set it for 2 hours. I don't know if it's going to cut us off. I have a subscription, so it shouldn't.
I think in 3 minutes it will cut off.
Okay.
Because
before we stop, I just want to say, first of all, this has been a really good discussion, right? And it's been very provocative. I'm actually kind of intrigued by trying out of discussion, trying to systematize it. But for those of you who are interested in, I could see this as a symposium in critical research on religion with a bunch of different contributions. But I would need some people to organize it since I'm the editor. If some of you want to get together and try to organize a symposium of short pieces on this question and different viewpoints, I think it would be really provocative before we break.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Warren. Thanks for hosting us. And I just want to tell one thing. I think maybe we can actually extend it for another round table. And that is how interpretations of religion and religious texts could actually help us to have like a repressive position or emancipatory position, because everybody now talked about different, for example, how religion is like that, how state is like that, and how they can interplay. But I think one question which is now we can actually think about and reflect upon it is the position of interpretation or the importance of interpretation. Because some interpretations, maybe when it comes, for example, to the women's right, we see it's very oppressive. But sometimes, for example, other interpretations of the same text makes, for example, very, very emancipatory. Or when it comes to, for example, immigrants, others, those who are different than us, some interpretations actually are very repressive, and some others become more, for example, open to the others. And we should not forget the importance of interpretation and how these interpretations interplay and where they get actually their inspiration and how they get constructed and reconstructed. This is, I think, a question we should think about it as well.
And if you want to do another panel, the center will be, glad to sponsor another one. So
sure.
We can do that again.
Where are you located, Warren? Where are you?
Boston.
Boston?
Yep.
Thank you.
Can I make a comment?
Hey, Steve. Yeah, Steve Collins. He did a lot of work, by the way, on Underground Railroad. My colleague, Steve Collins. And speaking of John Brown, by the way, that was his area. Go ahead, Steve. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I work on a town called Quindaro in 1857 in territorial Kansas. And John Brown was adored by the folks in Quindaro, and very much abolitionist and very much fanatical. As a matter of fact, one observer at the time said the people, this was a Missouri guy who they were pro-slave, said that the people in Quindaro are victims of harangue. And from a sympathetic point of view, from an abolitionist point of view, it wasn't harangue at all. It was revving up and focusing on bringing Kansas into the Union as a free state. Anyway, John Brown was totally focused. I remember hearing or reading someplace that he witnessed a slave master beat a slave with a shovel head to death.
That was in Michigan. Yep, that was in Michigan near Detroit.
Yes, right. And this motivated him dramatically. Imagine that being a young man and having that ingrained into your head, plus being highly religious. And it struck me as you were talking in this excellent discussion about something I didn't hear anyone say, but it's the notion of focus, that religion allows extreme focus. It seems like people that become successful have the ability in any thing that they do to focus on a particular issue and just brush anything else aside. And so the power of focus is just very extreme, I think, and I don't know if anybody's looked at that. Also, let me just say that the very first statue of John Brown was erected in Quindaro at Western University, which was the first African-American university west of the Mississippi. And it has been defaced, as many said. One time they put swastikas, other times they'll write, disgusting comments, and it's always cleaned off very quickly. People are very much revere that statue. The second thing I wanted to say was that I found it very interesting that the woman who at first took off her burqa and then after a while put it back on, and her comment that this is my interpretation, she had rejected Western views of women as flesh and not women as intellects, and that putting the burqa back on said, okay, you're going to have to deal with what I'm saying and how I am thinking. You can no longer deal with me as just a body. And that was very, very interesting. So let's see. I think that's about it. Thank you.
Yeah, one thing along that side, Dustin, what I said about Iran, the forcing of making hijab mandatory. If it wasn't for Western intervention early on and then trying to create social paralysis, I think, in Iran, that probably wouldn't happen. Because initially, even the Ayatollah was for, a choice. came to hijab. I think, am I right, Sayed? I think there were some statements from Ayatollah Khomeini that,
Yeah. It was Khomeini and Talighani, both of them.
Both of them, yeah. So it wasn't really initially a sort of, but then it became a reactionary.
Just a nice little tidbit there, little factoid. Just so you know that when President Trump was first talking about removing American soldiers from Afghanistan, and the Pentagon didn't want them to do it, want him to remove them, how they convinced him is that they brought pictures of Afghan women from the 1970s in skirts and no hijabs and whatnot, and said, "This is what it can be again if we stay there."
Oh.
That's how he was
liberating your image, huh? Oh boy.
I have a question about all that. So,
hey, Michael Hui, one of our groups here in Kansas City. Go ahead, Michael. Sorry.
So what I've heard about some of that is it prevents women from being raped. That apparently that some men are more likely to rape a woman in those cultures that are not.
No, actually, it started. Michael, actually, it started because women were being harassed. Therefore, they go in a choice. In fact, if you look at the same time period, men had more hijab, more things over their head than women did. So it was initially to protect women's rights, I guess. Initially, yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Michael. I didn't want to cut you off.
Well, you didn't necessarily cut me off, but that's one of the misperceptions I guess I've heard is that some men in some of those cultures, usually young men, go around and like in India where Brahmin men think that they can rape the women of lower caste, that kind of thing.
That's possible.
And then if they reject their sexual advances, sometimes they throw acid in their face and stuff like that. So the violent aspect of young men's behavior is what I'm curious if that plays into how some of these norms were started.
Part of that is to do with othering, isn't it? Because I remember when I met my wife in Israel and we were going through Bethlehem one day and her hair had gone very blonde in the sun and she had a small pair of shorts on and a little vest. And she was like the Pied Piper. We had something like about 400 Jewish young men following her around. And it's because she was othered. So we just thought that she was just advised to cover up and to not wear these Western clothes in certain places because she would be a target because of the way that she was dressing. And it was deemed to be inappropriate, but it was almost like they wouldn't treat Israeli girls like that, but they would treat the Western girls who were there volunteering like that. It's right. What was that guy called, Sayed, who did his PhD at Bristol? Mahmoud.
Oh, Mahmoud.
Mahmoud. And do you remember that his children came and his wife came to stay with him, and he even forbade them from watching the adverts on the telly, wouldn't let them watch TV because even the adverts were depraved. And for Mahmoud, they were not something he wanted his daughters to be influenced by or his wife.
Well, he lived in Bristol.
That's right.
Well, it was just UK TV generally, which is very depraved. We have naked women to sell baby food, you know.
Okay.
He wasn't in Germany, right?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and thanks, Warren, for allowing us to have that and hosting this wonderful roundtable. And hopefully, we can have the next one very soon.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Dustin. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Warren.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Very good panel.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good job.
Bye-bye.
Good job. Thank you.